Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll give it a few seconds to let folks join. All right. I'm going to start with some housekeeping items. I first want to welcome everyone today to our ILNet webinar on work plan development for Centers for Independent Living. My name is Mary Kate Wells, and I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm the program director at NICL, the National Council on Independent Living. NICL partners with the ILNet Training and Technical Assistance team to support the coordination of these webinars, and today I will be help facilitate behind the scenes. Next slide, please. And it's to slide 3. So today's presentation is brought to you by the Administration for Community Living at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in conjunction with the ILNet. The ILNet is operated by ILRU in collaboration with NICL, April, and University of Montana. And slide 4. The logos of all the collaborators are on the screen now. And you can, next slide. So the ILNet team Training and Technical Assistance Center provides training and technical assistance to Centers for Independent Living, statewide independent living councils, and designated state entities. And before we jump into today's webinar, just a few notes on accessibility for the webinar. Captions are available on this webinar. Click Show Subtitles in your Zoom menu to turn them on. We also have captioning running on an external link. That link will be put in the chat where you can change the font size and color to your preference. ASL interpreters are also present today and should always be visible as we're presenting in gallery view. Please let us know in the chat if you are not able to see the interpreters. The ASL interpreters are also available in a separate viewing screen. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom bar, you can press interpretation and select ASL if that is your preferred way of viewing the interpreters. We have Spanish interpreters today, which you can also use that button at the bottom of your screen to select which language you would like to hear the presentation on. We have public chat turned off, but you are still able to chat with panelists. We ask that you reserve the chat for requests on technical support, and then but not to use the chat for questions for panelists. But there's a number of ways that you can ask questions and engage with us today. If you're on Zoom, you can type your question in the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen and submit questions from there. You are also welcome to email me any questions at mary-kate@ncil.org, and we will also put that in chat. And just as a kind of note and reminder to folks that Zoom is having ongoing updates that have affected some of the accessibility features on Zoom, and it's created some challenges for some folks. So we are recommending that people join from their laptop or desktop, or having the option of using the ASL channel to view on a mobile device. All right, next slide. The goals of today's webinar is to identify elements of a strong work plan, how work plans can be used at Centers for Independent Living, and also how work plans can be used for internal evaluation. Next slide. And before handing it off to our two wonderful presenters today, just a reminder, at the end of the webinar, we'll be sharing an evaluation link. We appreciate any and all feedback. So if you have a minute to complete that evaluation, we would greatly appreciate it. So next slide. With that, I have the pleasure to introducing our first speaker, Forrest Hamrick from Able, South Carolina, and I am going to hand it off to Forrest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. But I am really happy to be here today and to talk a little bit about work plans. So just starting off, my name is Forrest Hamrick. I'm the Vice President and Chief Quality Officer at Able, South Carolina. And I use he, him pronouns. Just as a visual description, I'm a white male in my late 30s with brown hair, receding, and gold glasses and a blue collared shirt. So a little bit about me before we dive in, because one of the things that I absolutely love about IL is this is a movement led by people with disabilities. And I myself am a person with a disability that is in IL doing this work. And so I have been at Able, South Carolina for the past 9 years, almost 9.5 years. And I've been able to work in all different aspects of the work here. I started as an independent living specialist. I worked in employment, pre-education transition services, quality assurance, and got to see really all the aspects of that direct service and even some of the advocacy work that we are fortunate enough to do as Centers for Independent Living. For those of you that don't know about Able, South Carolina, of course, we're in South Carolina, and we're the state's oldest and largest center for independent living here. So we are celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and we serve about half the state of South Carolina. And one of the reasons I mention that is because to give you a little background about where I'm coming from and where Able's coming from when we start talking about work plans. Because we're a fairly large CIL. We cover both urban and rural areas. And so depending on what you are doing, where your CIL is, what your staff size is, when we're talking about work plans, they're going to be completely different. And we'll get into a little bit of why that is today. So for the first part of today's discussion, what I'm going to be covering is really 4 main things. The first one is just what a work plan is. You've probably heard bits and pieces of this as you've done your PPR every year or gotten feedback. So I want to talk about what it is. I want to discuss why we even have them, why it's a best practice, why that we're required to. Then we're going to talk through the different parts of a work plan, what they have, what they need to have. And finally, I'm going to go over how to create one. And then I'm going to turn it off to Tyler, hand it off to Tyler to really tell you how to use these in your CIL and all the great things they can do for that. So let's just kick things right off and let's go to the next slide. So let's start with what a work plan is. And this is the definition I'm using, and you'll hear me repeat it a lot, but it is your action plan for how you are going to serve your community for the next year. We have so many different plans and planning documents we use as CILs. A lot of them are required, right? So our strategic plan, having a state plan of independent living. But your work plan is pretty limited in the sense that it's what's your community going to, how you're going to serve your community in that next year. And so it's a really good plan to be kind of a foundation for a lot of things. Most of you will really be thinking about this and working on a work plan as you complete your PPR, your program performance report, every year. And part of that is because, the PPR, it looks backwards. It looks at what you've accomplished during this past year. And the work plan is really your chance on that big federal report that all the CILs have to fill out to talk about what your goal is moving forward, how you're really going to serve your community, how the CIL is going to adapt to the changes that are there. So those are the basics parts of a work plan. Is this action plan? But I also want to mention that it is different than the other plans that we have in place. So you are going to have, as a Center for Independent Living, a strategic plan. So like a 3-year plan that's really going to cover what you want your CIL to grow into, where your strategic goals are. Could be focused on buildings, staffing levels, growing all different programs. So you can have that as a strategic plan. You'll use that. You're also going to have your state plan for independent living, your SPIL, and that's your statewide plan. So even if you are just, serving 1 or 2 counties, you're serving 1/10 of your state or whatever, you're going to be feeding into what your entire state goal is for your independent plan. And I'm not going to go any further into either of those because I know that at Nickel there will be some sessions on definitely the SPIL and probably strategic plan, and I don't want to step on any of that. But I do mention that just to say that you're already doing so many different parts of the work plan, because the work plan is informed by all these different things that you're collecting and doing every single year. So it's going to be formed by that strategic plan you have. It's going to be informed by that SPIL. You're going to get input from your community about what's going on and how we can fix it. And then you're even going to look at your PPR and figure out where the gaps are. What are you doing really well? What are you not doing well? So we're going to start to move on, but I want you to take away that it's just this action plan. There's going to be lots of different parts that come into it, but you're not pulling in brand new stuff that you've never seen before. The work plan is going to be just right along the same lines that you've been doing with your work so far. So let's go to the next slide. So we have our work plans, and this is what we're going to be creating. I'm going to give you the outline of how to do it, but I also think it's really important to talk about why we even have work plans. Shouldn't our strategic plan or our SPIL be enough? And one of the things that I really want to say about why we even have this is because it is ingrained in IL philosophy. Every single work plan is going to be adapted to the specific CIL that makes it, because you are adapting to the needs of your community. You're adapting to the needs of the individuals that come into contact with your CIL. And so not one size is going to fit all for this. And one of the amazing things and things I love about CILs is we are community based, right? The community that we serve here at Able, and we kind of have half the state, is going to be widely different than even some of our sister CILs here in South Carolina. The population they're going to be serving, that could be the demographics, whether they're rural or urban, are going to have different needs than our center. And each of your centers is going to have a vastly different needs about where you're at and what you're doing. And that's kind of at the center of IL philosophy, right? It's going to be individually based. It's going to be adapting and growing to what is the need of the individual and the community. So as I talk through all this information about work plans, I want you to be thinking about how you can adapt it to the size and scope of your own CIL. If you're serving a county, what is the impact you want to have in that county? If you're serving almost the entire state because of where you're at, how are you going to start thinking about the impact you're going to make there? And I do have this note on the slide that just talks about work plans being best practice. And there's so much, studies and research and all that just about, if you write down a plan, if you think through a plan, you are much more likely to succeed and to make progress towards it. And a lot of different reasons for that, right? A lot of times it's just now we have a benchmark that we can be moving towards. We've actually thought about the consequences of what we're doing. And that's what we're going to bring into what we're talking about today with the work plan. Let's go on to the next slide, because this is still continuing with the IL philosophy and stuff that I've already mentioned, that these work plans, and one of the reasons that we have them is that they can be centered on your community. They can be centered on the individuals that you serve. It's not going to be something that comes down directly from ACL or directly from any other large body that says, hit these check marks, do this. to have a successful work plan. This is going to be what's successful for you and your community and the individuals you serve. So be creative with it. Make it adapt to your community. Let's go on to the next slide. I also like to talk about this because even though it is very much into, our philosophy to have individualized plans and to think through how we're going to serve our community, it's also a requirement of our funding. So part of the Rehabilitation Act, Title VII, Section 725, talks about the things that we need to have as we plan to do our work as a Center for Independent Living. And it specifically mentioned work plans and that they are not your strategic plan and they're not your spill, but they're informed by it. So it can be one of those key documents that you're using to make sure that you are serving your community. You're serving who you want to serve with this. Next slide. There we go. So I have here just some on the screen, just some quick summarizing of that requirement. So CILs will establish clear priorities through annual and 3-year program and financial planning objectives for the center. So this is from the Act. This includes overall goals or a mission for the center, a work plan for achieving those goals or missions, specific objectives, service priorities, and types of services that will be provided, and a description that will demonstrate how the proposed activities of the CIL are consistent with the most recent 3-year spill under Section 704. So there's 3 parts, right? So we have our work plan for achieving the goals and missions. That's what we're going to focus on today. But we are establishing those priorities through our 3-year strategic plan and our 3-year spill. So let's go to the next slide. So we kind of have a working definition of what a work plan is, your action plan for a year. We know why we're going to have them. If it's our philosophy and it's a requirement. But now let's talk about how we're going to create a plan. And that's really the bulk of what we're talking about here. And the first thing I want to mention is that these are unique. It's going to be unique to your center because it is going to respond to the needs of your community and service area. You are the ones that are going to drive this, the scope of it. Your size and the capacity of your CIL is going to determine what you're able to do with this, which is great because you're not trying to fit in another center's plan to make it work for your community. That's not going to work. That's the reason we're community based. Let's go to the next slide. So we know it's going to be unique. We know it's going to be specific to your CIL. So I'm going to give you some steps to create that work plan. And one of the things that I want to keep on pointing out is you already have almost all of these documents. You're probably already thinking a lot about what you're going to do during the next year. Making a work plan is, it should feel very comfortable. It's not going to be something that you should ever be scared about. This is stuff that you're already doing as you're just planning your work as a CIL. But before you really start developing what your work plan is going to be, I have a few things listed on the screen I'm going to read through that are going to be really, really useful for you to have and to reference. The first thing is your CIL strategic plan. You know, that's your real plan for the next 3 years as you develop as a CIL. You're also going to have whatever your current spill is. Those are also typically 3 years. But I know we also just had an extension and submitted our next one as we go to a new system. So whatever your current spill is, you're going to make sure to have that information. When you're developing your work plan, you are doing this hand in hand typically as you complete your PPR every year. So make sure that you have that complete, that you know what your core services are, that you know what your gaps in services are, that you can look back at that past year and think about how you can improve. And then finally, a community needs assessment. Now, this can be completely different for every single center. I know in South Carolina, what we do for um, our Silk does a needs assessment every 3 years, statewide through a survey. So we get a lot of information from that. But just as important is all the information you're getting directly from the consumers you serve. So if you're starting to hear more about difficulty with affordable housing and it's coming up much more often than you thought, that's a community needs assessment right there. You can start to identify areas of need in your community. So you're going to have these 4 documents, and let's go to the next slide. And you're going to walk through really these 4 steps. One, you're going to look at common themes. You're going to find some between all 4 of these documents. I know we have as a CIL, and that could be things like looking at transition into community. Are you seeing a theme in your spill that we need to address housing and affordable housing? Are you also seeing that from needs assessments and the services you're providing? Maybe you're providing a lot of transition to housing. Maybe you're our community, or maybe you're not providing a lot of transition to the community. Look for those themes. You're going to find them because these are over, all 4 documents, the things that we are doing. This is the hard work that CILs are doing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is think about your community. What changes do you want to see in the next year? This could be directly in response to some of these themes. It could also be directly in response to what's happening in the community. Another example I'll give you from South Carolina. So our legislator runs in 2-year cycles. So when we're deciding what changes we want to see as maybe as advocacy goes, or by informing the community and informing legislators about what's important to our community, we think of it in 2-year cycles versus every single year or every 3 years. But I also know that that's completely different in other states. Some have year-round legislators, some meet every other year. So think about what your community needs and what change can be made. And then step 3, what areas of your PPR need improvement? This is going to come up as you go through your PPR, and that could be areas that you're not serving. So if you're serving 10 counties, but 2 of them you're only serving 1 or 2 people in that county, that's going to be something the ACL is going to want to address. And that's a perfect area for when you start making an action plan about how you can reach your entire community, which is really important too. We want to serve the entire community. Same thing when we think about the PPR, be thinking about demographics. Are you serving, 85% of people with just physical disabilities? What's your percentage of people with psychiatric disabilities or cognitive disabilities or blindness or anything like that? Are you missing parts of our community that we need to address in our work plan? And then finally, is it feasible for your center? So you may come away with this for like 25 things you want to do in the next year. That's not feasible for most CILs. I mean, we have about 60, 70 staff here at Able. And so we know that would not be feasible for us. I know some centers have 150, some centers have 5, right? So be thinking about what's feasible for you and what's going to make the most impact. It is perfectly okay with your work plan to have 1 or 2 key things that you're really focusing on to change and work on in the next year versus 20 things that you may be able to complete, but are they really making an impact? So think through all 4 of those, and that's what I use those key resources and documents for. Let's go to the next slide. So we have kind of our list of like, here are our impact areas. Here are the things that we want to make sure that we address in our work plan. Well, I wanted to share a tool. It was released about a year ago. probably last September, but it's the outcome measurement toolkit for CILs. And I know that the actual link to the PDF is going to be shared either in the chat or at the end of this PowerPoint. But this was a great tool created by ILRU, RTC Rule, and it is a step-by-step guide. So each chapter will walk you through each part of how to create outcomes and measure the outcomes for your CIL. There's a lot of worksheets, there's a lot of guides. It is very easy to use, and they're going to give you specific examples for CILs. So you're not going to be trying to make a random nonprofit example work for you. So we don't have time to go through that. If we went through that, that would be 2-3 trainings. It's a very, very big tool, but I do want to let you know that that's an option. And I also want to talk through some of the key parts of that toolkit that you can start using now. So let's go to the next slide. So from the toolkit, I'm going to use some of their verbiage like outcomes, outputs, activities. They have even more, but I'm going to give you just a very simple work plan structure. And as I've mentioned before, this is going to be specific to you. So don't feel like you need to use this work plan structure. I'm just giving you just a very simple structure that if you need a place to start, here are 3 items you can have. You can structure them and have a successful work plan and then make it evolve to fit what you need. So with that, our work plan structure is going to have 3 things. It's going to have outcomes. So those are what you want to change. So all of these will be tied to a question because that's how I think things through. So what do you want to change? Then we have outputs, which is how much work and what work are you doing to make that change? And then finally, we have activities. What actions or like action verbs are you going to take to make that change? And how will you do the work? So we're going to focus on these 3 things, and we're going to break each one down. So don't be overwhelmed by new words. Hopefully you've already seen a good amount of these as you've worked through different plans with your strategic plan or SPIL, but we're going to break each of these down as a very, very simple way of structuring this. Let's go to the next slide. So I think one of the best things to do is always start with your outcomes, right? You need to be knowing where you're going to go to reach that location. So when I'm thinking of outcomes, I want to think of a few things that I want to change in the community. So an outcome is the change that you want in the community. I have 2 examples here. So one outcome could be consumers will demonstrate improved independent living skills at home. Maybe that's the outcome you want in your community because you're really going to focus on transition to the community. And those IL skills are going to be important. Another example I have is maybe one of your outcomes is state government buildings will be more accessible to people with disabilities. All right, so these are outcomes. These are changes we want to see made in the community. And you will find these outcomes by looking at those key resources and documents and finding those themes that we talked about. So whatever your list was, whether it was 2 things or 15 things, you're going to find out what those main outcomes, what changes you want to see in your community. Let's go to the next slide. So once you have your outcomes, you need to think about what your outputs are going to be. And this is the work that you're going to do to make that change. So make that outcome happen in the community. And I like to think of outputs as numbers. These are things that we can count, right? So how many of this are we going to do? How long are we going to do something? And the reason we count these is because we can't always control what the outcome is. Right? So we can't necessarily control that government buildings are more accessible. As a CIL, we don't necessarily have that power. We're not we can't come in there and find or do anything like that. But we can control the steps that we're taking to make that change. and we can record the steps that we're taking, right? So how much work we are doing to achieve this goal. So some examples of that could be maybe counting the number of consumers served that worked on IL skills in the home. So maybe setting that goal of we're going to work with 100 consumers on IL skills at home. We can count that. Or maybe we're going to count the number of hours we spend teaching IL skills at home. So maybe it's 10 hours a person. And same thing when we're talking about making government buildings more accessible, maybe we set a number for state buildings that we assess for accessibility. So a physical accessibility assessment. We can count that number and we can say we did 15 buildings. And we are hoping that that's leading to better outcomes, right? That they're going to take that information, make the changes, and we're going to see that outcome. But we always can't control the outcome, so we're just going to measure what our outputs are. And I hate how similar they are. They just both start with the word out, and so I start to like get tongue-tied just talking about them. So always feel free to slow down when you have to start thinking through this. I do all the time. And then let's go to the next slide on this, which a little bit more closely on outputs. Outputs can be your measuring stick or your statistic as well. So when we think about outcomes, it can also be things like 85% showed an increased knowledge of blank, independent living skills. We served more people in this community. So look closely at your PPR. I think the PPR is a great spot to start thinking about where you may have gaps in services that may actually be stopping you from achieving those outcomes. So some good examples are, if we're talking about transition to the community, which I talk about a lot because it is such a difficult core service, because it depends so much on the structures that exist in your state, in your community. And a lot of times we do not have direct control on that outcome, right? If there are no affordable, accessible housing, it is very difficult to have good outcomes for that. But maybe we can go and look at our PPR and make sure that we're not stopping ourselves just because of who we're serving. So good examples of that. If we're thinking about transition to the community, what age group of people are we working with? Are we only doing transition to community for people that are over 55? Well, there's a lot of people that need diversion from institutes or transition out of institutes that are younger than 55. Like, we should be doing transition to community services, probably in transition in high school, but definitely in, 18 to 30 as well. Of like, how are people going to move out from living in a family unit to on their own? What happens if the family unit changes? That could be things that we're looking at, gaps that could actually impact what our outcomes are. So always be thinking about the gaps that you have with your PPR. Let's go to the next slide. So we have our outcomes, so what we want to change. We have our output, what we're measuring. And then we have our activity. This is what your CIL is doing, your staff is doing to accomplish and get those numbers, right? And we can do multiple activities, and you probably will be doing multiple activities. Activities use action words such as serve, assess, teach, conduct. So to give you a few examples here, independent living, for example, for teaching IL skills, an independent living specialist will teach IL skills in the home of the consumer. That is your action, right? You may have other activities in there, and it could be things like information referral specialist will distribute information about home safety and emergency kits, right? You will hold trainings about emergency safety, because that can always be such a big skill for helping people transition into the home. Can they protect themselves? Can they stay safe in their home? Another example, if we're going back to our assessing government buildings, the assistant director will identify and conduct assessments of state government buildings, right? So we're saying that these are the actions the assistant director will want to do. And that's going to lead to our output. So it's going to be however many they decide to do, which is hopefully going to make a change in our outcomes. And let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to go over these examples in just a second and wrap up my part of the presentation. But I do want to say the ones I'm going to be giving you are very simplistic because they're supposed to be work plan outcomes. Again, make this fit your center, make this fit the activities that you need to do. You can have multiple outputs lead to an outcome. You can have multiple activities lead to an output. You can make these very big, very small, depending on what you need. So here's an example I have of that outcome that we talked about, of that able South Carolina consumers will demonstrate improved IL skills at home. So we said, this is an example, we don't have this on our work plan, but an example could be like, we've identified that we need better IL skills at home. That's stopping people from living independently. So we've identified that, and that's what we want our outcome to be. So our first output is going to be that able South Carolina will attend 5 outreach events in the community. The reason we would choose that one is because we need to actually be serving consumers for this skill, and maybe people don't know that we teach it, right? We need to be serving more people, making sure people know about everything that a center does. So that's our first output. And we have an activity. Well, and with the output, you'll notice there's a number there, 5. We're going to do 5 outreach events. And then the activity 1, it's who's going to do the work for that output. So we have the community coordinator will identify and attend outreach events. The coordinator will share information about working with an ILS for building skills at home. So we can kind of see that clear line of activity to output to outcome. Let's go to the next page. Great. Again, this is the same outcome, right? We're trying to have consumers demonstrate improved IL skills, but we have a second output, and that is 100 consumers will work on IL skills at home. So pretty much what we're saying is, if we work with enough consumers, 100 consumers, we're going to see improved IL skills at home. And then our activity for that is that ILS, independent living specialists, will travel to meet consumers in their home to teach and practice IL skills. So we have exactly what they'll be doing. And I always think we are community-based. If we're teaching anything that's in IL skills at home, if we can do it in the home, that is the best place for us to do it, unless it's just not possible. So we have that written in there as well. And let's go to the next slide. And then we have our third output. So we have the same outcome. They're going to demonstrate these IL skills. So our third output is another measuring stat, right? 85% of consumers will report an increase in skills after working with an ILS. So we're going to do some kind of survey. So a lot of you will already have some kind of satisfaction survey. So maybe we add this. Because again, we want, of those 100 people that we serve, we want 85 of them to report an increase in skill. And we want that to lead to that outcome of more people showing improved IL skills at home. And the activity, ILS will include an outcome question and consumer satisfaction surveys after working with the consumer. So we can go into more detail in the future about whether that needs to be after a certain amount of time. So you could build that in, if it's just when the case is closed, if it's just yearly, and get a sense of what each thing looks like. So that is a very basic overview about the CIL work plans. Again, you can make these work for your CIL, and I'm going to start turning it over to Tyler, who can talk about how we can use these plans, whatever you create, for making your center stronger and some of the barriers that come up with it. So I'll turn it over to you, Tyler.
Thank you, Forrest. I appreciate that. And it's great to be with all of you this afternoon. My name's Tyler Morris. I am the Executive Director for the CIL here in Jacksonville, Florida. I've been with our CIL now for about 17 years, and about 7 of which I've been privileged to lead. as the executive director. For any CILs that are on the call, I've also been able to serve, very honored by serving as the Network of Centers representative on the Florida Independent Living Council. A little bit about our agency, or about our CIL. We have a 5-county catchment area. So when you're looking at Florida, it is the top right-hand corner. That's very close to Georgia. So we have a team of a little over 20 staff members, a little bit different than our friends there in Able, South Carolina, but we're doing similar work as well. So today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the barriers that you might experience with work plans, talking a little bit about some of the ways that you can be successful, and also some of the resources that you're available. But before I begin, I'd like to give a quick visual description. I am a white male in my late 30s with a beard and brown hair, wearing a black polo. I am sitting in my office at the CIL, so joining you from our offices. So next slide, please. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about with you are some of the common barriers that you might experience with CIL work plans. And some of these might even be transferable to your larger and bigger plans. The first is a lack of alignment and clarity. When your objectives in your work plan are either unclear or ambiguous, it can hinder your planning process. And without that understanding of where the organization wants to go, it's challenging to develop that plan to get there. One of the things that I think is critical for us as Centers for Independent Living is making sure that we're aligned to the independent living philosophy, that we are not experiencing mission drift. And if we are not clear on what our outputs and outcomes are, we might find ourselves chasing something that might get us a little bit further away from the independent living philosophy or mission drift. So making sure that there is that connection between your work plan and the organizational priorities, the values, that is imperative for you to make sure that you are connected. Because if it's not, it can lead to plans that are maybe irrelevant or unachievable. So aligning that ensures that the strategic, or that plan resonates with stakeholders and also addresses the current challenges and opportunities. The next is undefined metrics, and I think probably one of the best examples is a story that I'll tell you really quickly. Is recently I was able to sit in an IEP meeting, and there as an advocate, and it gets to the point of looking at some of these goals for the upcoming school year, and it is something to the effect of student will learn 20 additional words. And then you ask the questions of the metrics. Who or what, how is that going to be captured? What are the current metrics? Where is the current baseline? So not being clear on those, or how you will measure those benchmarks and successes will not be successful. So being very clear on what your objectives are is really an important thing to have. How you are going to measure those, what those metrics have historically done. I have with some of the information that we have, we know that funders are moving to a more return on investment for awards that they provide. And communicating metrics in plain language is very, very important. You know, we have things that we look at on the day-to-day. We know number of services, goals achieved, goals set. Those are very common for us. But being very clear, like the example that Forrest gave earlier, 100 consumers worked on their IL skills at home. Some of those things are more tangible for us as CILs to communicate to different stakeholders in our community. The third point that I'll talk about is limited resources. You know, if you have a feeling of being overwhelmed of getting this set up, maybe it's even for your strategic plan, you are not alone. And remember to don't tire yourself or your team or exhaust your resources. Your goal through this is to apply the skills and the resources where they can make the most impact. So when you're going into this, make sure that you have enough resources, and time being probably one of the most important, that you have the ability to dedicate that time and effort to that planning process. You know, this barrier can present as, you know, oftentimes feeling rushed or maybe an incomplete plan. So be mindful of your resources. The fourth is resistance to change. Maybe you have already heard in the past, maybe, you know, we haven't done that in the past, or that didn't work for us. And those are, you know, some important things to listen to. But if that is something that might have happened 20 years ago, you might have to ask the question, is this change that we are trying to make with our work plan and the activities that we are trying to implement, will it work for this period with the staff and the resources and the partners that we have in our community? You know, it might be just a resistance from, you know, a fear from the unknown, maybe concerns about job security, or maybe just this is how we've always done it. But one of the things that I like to encourage is don't be, you know, risk adverse. There are some significant things that can happen by taking reasonable risks as a Center for Independent Living. The next is short-term focus, which is if you are just looking down and not ahead, that can be very detrimental to implementing the work plan. Those day-to-day operations can divert your attention from that longer-term plan. It's important, but know when it is best used. You know, this barrier can maybe prevent organizations from investing adequate time and resources into planning the future for sustainability and growth. And the last bullet on this slide is poor communication. If you are ineffective with the communication about this plan, you know, the objectives, outcomes, outputs, activities, it can lead to misunderstandings and a lack of buy-in from stakeholders. You know, one of the things I always quote, Brene Brown says, clear is kind. And by providing, you know, a clear, transparent communication channel, you can build support and commitment to the plan. Next slide, please. The next topic is complexity and overcomplication. Sometimes we might be guilty of that ourselves, me being one of them. And I have to be mindful of, you don't have to add a million things to solve an answer that's already in front of you. So making sure that you don't have an overly complex planning process or the documents, so it doesn't overwhelm the people that are trying to make the plan happen or you know, execute it, and it will prevent from, you know, confusion, or it may lead to confusion rather than clarity. So remember that your plan should be accessible, it should be actionable, it should be focusing on those priorities that you have for that year. So you don't have to always create a new spreadsheet to find the answer for yourself. The next is leadership challenges. Making sure that you have the support and engagement throughout the process will really prevent you from hindering progress. You'll move a lot faster together and further together when you have buy-in from all different levels of leadership. And that's going to be crucial for you to drive that planning process forward, making the collaboration and maybe making decisions. And environmental uncertainty might also be a common barrier. You might have been in the middle of a strategic plan or a work plan when we all got this news that there was a virus that was sweeping across our nation. And we had to be very nimble and adaptable during that time. So, make sure that you are looking at rapidly changing factors. Maybe it's an economic shift, maybe it's a tech advancement or regulatory changes. Make sure that you are ahead of those and avoid any uncertainty or disrupt your progress in your plan. And making sure that you adapt to that external conditions. And lastly, past failures. Looking at maybe how unsuccessful a past plan has been, it can lead to skepticism or reluctance to engage in future planning efforts. And overcoming that is going to require, learning from those past mistakes and demonstrating the value of the strategic planning through implementation and buy-in. Right. Next slide, please. Having those barriers and pitfalls aside, let's talk about some of the strategies for having a relevant and successful plan. And I think the first and foremost, and that is why it is in bold and underlined, is rooting your plan in CIL. There is a reason why we say nothing about us without us. When people with disabilities are the drivers of work plans, they are successful. And as Forrest mentioned earlier, work plans are a best practice. Whether it's a spill, a strategic plan, or your work plan, when the work is anchored in the foundation of independent living, you will be successful. The next is aligning to strategic plan and spill where possible. These are just two of some sources of inputs that you have that help shape those work plans. How does it align? Making sure that there is a connection there and knowing why there is that connection. Making sure that you are not being short-sighted like we talked about as a common barrier, but being aware that this feeds into a bigger picture and a bigger plan for you. Being clear with objectives and monitoring key performance indicators, which we sometimes say as key KPIs, it's really important to define and track those KPIs that connect to your work plan. And using these metrics to demonstrate progress objectively, right? Some of the questions that you might be considering when you're looking at these is, are you achieving the desired outcomes? Do we need to adjust our strategy? Does the work plan remain aligned, with our overarching mission, our vision, our values, the independent living philosophy? Should we look at new initiatives or make adjustments that support this plan? Or maybe it's we hit our target. Now what? So being mindful to review those objectives and monitoring those key performance indicators are really important. And conducting regular reviews and updates, making sure that you have scheduled time to not just develop a work plan and it sits there. Schedule consistent updates at intervals that make sense for your CIL. Just like a work plan will have to make sense for your CIL, the review of it and updating it needs to make sense for intervals that are not going to exhaust your resources. This keeps the stakeholders, whether it's consumers, staff, board members, informed without overwhelming them. And you can do this in a lot of ways that we'll talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Another strategy to keeping a relevant and successful CIL work plan is scanning the environment. So just like we talked about, a pitfall is, maybe a big change happens that you're not aware of, making sure that you have these inputs of information that might impact the ability for consumers to achieve their goals at home or whatever it may be, making sure that you're aware of those trends. Maybe it's opportunities. Maybe it's not just things that can threaten the success of a work plan, but also an opportunity that might help you achieve the outcome faster. So making sure that you scan that environment is really important. Staying informed of any market shifts, any tech changes that you have. Maybe there is a new system that's available through your data management software. I said that we're in Florida, and just so like something that we did not plan for are all of the hurricanes that have popped up, but that's also an environmental change that we have to consider. Our property insurance and our insurance skyrocketed these premiums. Just so you know, in the past 5 years in Florida alone, the costs for business insurance surged like 125%. And, the premiums last year were, an increase of 27%, which was almost what we saw here at our CIL. So that could impact and significantly what you're planning on doing if some of your activities are tied to revenue. So the good news is that CILs are inherently programmed to scan the environment because we are disability-led organizations. We have a team of over the majority that are people with disabilities that bring in things that they have either through serving consumers or their walks. We bring that to the table because we have that lived experience. The next is engaging stakeholders and leveraging your networks. Seek feedback from your teams, your consumers, your partners, the stakeholders, and make sure that all of those team members or that they have an understanding of what the objectives are and the activities, and that there is buy-in and what their role is in this work plan. This is a living, breathing document, and this is going to be a guide for us. So it's important that we all are very clear on it. So like I said, don't let the plan collect dust. Maybe you'll hold a kickoff meeting or training session for your team with maybe the work plan's purpose, expected outcomes, the why, how it connects to IL, how it connects to the community, what impact it would be for our consumers. Next is being flexible and agile, making sure that you are learning and adapting from anything that you're experiencing through the work plan process, understanding that mistakes are a part of learning and growing. I know that we're often told this, but it's also important to remember it ourselves. Just making sure that you are building flexibility into your plan to accommodate any unforeseen changes or opportunities. And that will allow you to pivot and maybe reallocate resources for new priorities or challenges that you might have. And fostering a culture of learning and adaptation within your organization is important to be flexible and agile, so that folks are empowered to find their own answers and solutions by being guided by the work plan. And encourage that continuous improvement by learning from both the successes and the setbacks that you have from your plan. The last bullet is using technology and data appropriately, and I really would like to stress that just because it's there does not mean you have to run a million reports. So keep it simple, but use it to its best and highest use. Like I said earlier, put the skills to good use where they matter most, the highest and best use, which is connecting and empowering our consumers. But leverage that technology and the data tools for insights, for informing decision-making, making sure that the formatting is consistent is very helpful. No one likes a report format that's changed in the middle of a time period. So making sure that that is consistent and it speaks to the stakeholders that you're communicating about the progress of your work plan with. Next slide, please. Maintain communication and transparency is another way to maintain a relevant and successful SIL work plan. And that means maintaining open communication channels, sharing the progress, challenges faced, adjustments that need to be made, and above all, that communication is listen, listen, listen. Remember that what you are communicating or how you're communicating the information is as equally important as what you are trying to communicate. So really fostering that transparency builds trust and engagement across the stakeholders that are involved in the work plan. And last point for this bullet is just know where to find help and don't be afraid to ask for it. A commitment and balanced oversight is also important for a relevant and successful work plan, making sure that there is buy-in at all levels for this, remembering also that that you have that you need to demonstrate the flexibility to respond to changes, but also to balance that oversight too. You might be focused on work plan activities, understanding that bills need to still be paid, lights need to stay on, this program still needs attention. So make sure that there is an equitable balance on the oversight of the program. And lastly, celebrate the achievements and work to remove those barriers. So take time to enjoy the progress that you've made in the work plan, throughout the year. Celebrate those successes and milestones that you've reached. Acknowledge the challenges that you have, though. I mean, it's not all, it's not, all just celebration. You have to address also very transparently those setbacks honestly, and how those strategies are you're going to use to address them. And remember, for those that are maybe starting or looking at their work plan, that we all started somewhere, and that mistakes are a natural part of achieving success. So remember to treat setbacks as learning opportunities, and refine your strategies and be stronger moving forward. Next slide, please. Where do you get information to inform your work plan? We have those documents, but we also have a great network of people that we have at our disposal to help support our work. We have, first and foremost, people with disabilities, including SIL staff and board. Our peer-to-peer networks are very important to use. Nickel is coming up, and I hope to see some of you there, and I'll be presenting on how to create those peer-to-peer networks with a few of my peers on a panel. And it's a really great resource to have and build to support your work plan accomplishments and just your personal and professional growth. You also have your state membership associations maybe in your state. You might have you'll definitely have your SILC. These are also resources for you. ILNet, training and TA, and also ILRU. There are things that you can click on and learn from very easily on the database for strategic planning being one of them as an example. And also your community partners. These are really important to think because they might already have a strategic plan that they're working on because of a need that they've identified. So reach out to them and make sure that you're staying, maybe, here in Jacksonville, there's a community health needs assessment. And we were very involved in that process of providing input, connecting consumers to provide input, and then also the formulation of what we have done with our city for that. And making progress with that. Next slide, please. Funders have input. If you have been, surveying, maybe you have an object or an activity that you have identified in your work plan, and you don't know how you're going to maybe fund it. Scanning the environment on looking at what the priorities are for maybe some of the large organizations or businesses in your area that align to their strategic priorities is a great way to connect what you're trying to do to resources that might be available. Legislators, I think, Forrest talking about, making sure that we have that connection is really important, as well as consultants. You don't have to do it alone. You can engage people to help provide you information and support. Historical documents and data trends are really another way to inform that. And lastly, artificial intelligence. I know that I don't think that we're talking enough about it, honestly, but maybe an activity from this session is just putting in ChatGPT, who are the top disability providers in my area. Like, you can get so much information that is available to you just to consider. If not law, you just consider it as another input. So those are some resources and inputs that are also available to you. And lastly, I would just like to end with some practical applications that we and other CILs might have used to help with work plans. And the first is creating a shared calendar. Everybody's got a calendar that's created. And if you label it work plan and you share it across your teams, it might help, monitor those benchmarks and progress, or at least schedule time for reviewing those benchmarks and progress. Using your PPR is a great way to create a training plan if you're going to incorporate that as part of your work plan. Section 8 is not just for the executive director to fill out. You can share that with, your staff and also your board to see what training priorities might be important for your team in the upcoming year. And integrate it into onboarding. When you have somebody that's joining your team, it's really great to not only know what the strategic plan is, but what the priorities are for this year, and also for how that fits into what their roles are and where their responsibilities are. Incorporating staff personal and professional goals are really, really important too. Listening throughout the year is a great way. Sometimes I think we might get a little overwhelmed of thinking about having to schedule these big, listening sessions and town halls and the resources that are important to make that happen. But you can make some simple changes, like the highlights that our team submits to our board every month, not just talk about highlights, but they also talk about barriers, and how Forrest was talking about the common themes in our community. Your teams are a really great resource to know what those barriers are for consumers, and also things that you could potentially address as a Center for Independent Living. So incorporating that into a process of monthly reporting is a great way to get some feedback. Next slide, please. aligning performance evaluations, how are you incorporating the success of your work plan into the review of your team? And also, how are you incorporating goals, and that includes the executive director, in what those that upcoming plan is for a staff member? So remember to include that feedback of maybe some of those things that your team would like to get more training on, some of the skills trainings that might be needed to address health outcomes. There's a lot of good examples there. So, you know, we have recently shifted our performance evaluations from an anniversary to a calendar to align closer to the end of our fiscal. So that might be something that you consider. Using slide decks at staff meetings is really great, making sure that you're sending out in advance to make sure that it's accessible. But if you want to focus on something for a big win or something that needs attention, you know, drawing attention to that through appropriate visuals and descriptions is a good way to get buy-in from the team. We already talked about creating templates for consistent formats. No one wants 5 reports when it just needs to be 1. So make sure that you're creating templates that are not overkill, but get the job done. And one of the other things that you can do is scan the environment with Google Alerts. There's a lot of information to digest, especially recently. And so getting through that noise to something that's going to benefit you, your team, your CIL, you can create a Google alert with, you know, creating some keywords. Maybe it's your CIL's name. Maybe it's disability in the catchment area that you're in. Maybe your outcome and activities that are tied to health outcomes. You can look for health fairs, right? So you can check off those 5 outreaches that you're going to do with your work plan. So those are some of the strategies that you can use in a practical way to get your work plans done. So next slide, please, which I think are questions and answers. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you so much, Tyler and Forrest. That was a lot of information, but very well organized and really clear. So I'm also a fan of Brene Brown Tyler, so I like that quote. We have time for plenty of discussion and question and answer. So please put your questions in the chat, or what barriers are you facing? But for right now, we have one question in the chat, and I think this was during Forrest's presentation. So Forrest, if you want to answer this, but the question is, how many outcomes, outputs, activities should be in a work plan?
Sure, and of course, anybody's welcome to jump in with this as well, because this really is going to depend on your CIL and a lot of what Tyler was talking about, like what resources you have. So just to give you some kind of guideposts to think through, I think one, as far as outcomes go ahead and start small and build out. So think first about what's just on your PPR. Are there areas as far as outcomes you need to improve year over year? Then you can start moving into things outside of our 5 core services. Maybe not directly touching on some of the consumer work we do. That could be things that you want to expand out advocacy. And then what kind of legislator you want to do. I think starting small can always be a good thing, and trying to adjust any that are issues that you're having with the 5 core services, and improving those is always a great place to start. As far as outputs and activities, I will say I think it's really useful to have at least 2 outputs for every outcome. And one of those outputs is just the counting stat of 100 trainings, 5 trainings, 50 new employees, whatever that be. And then the other one being something you're measuring to show that what you're doing is actually working, right? So if you train 100 people, are you also doing any kind of survey to see if it was effective? Same thing, like if you were doing stuff in education, it would be things like, are they improving their grades by 5 percentage points or whatever. So you can set something to show that it is working. And then activities is really, it's just going to fit whatever the outputs are. Sometimes you're going to have multiple activities just to reach each output, but sometimes it'll just be one.
Awesome. Thank you. And to folks, please add questions or challenges or barriers or successes even that you're going through with work plans. Since we don't have anyone in the chat, I can ask a question to our presenters. One of the things that Tyler, you mentioned was about engaging staff within the CIL in the work plan process. And I'm just curious a little bit of what that could look like, or if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Thinking about when we started our plan, we had a kickoff, everybody, was aware of it, but there's a lot of stuff that was leading up to that. And, to establish that buy-in with your teams, it's really important that you're listening to those issues that they're bringing. Sometimes we hear it over and over and over again. And even if it is not you're picking up and saying, we're going to solve this as a CIL, having that, very transparent communication of like, I understand that it is an issue. We might not be the best organization to fix it because there is another organization that's already doing this. Let's support their initiatives. So listening to the team members going into this plan, a strategic plan or whatnot is really important, and having those check-ins. And if you are not maybe directly managing a team, but maybe you're more oversight and compliance or quality assurance, having these system of channels for that input up is really important. So keeping them engaged, we have our staff meetings that have, our PowerPoint presentations that we talk about priorities that we need to address. And that helps to make sure that relevancy continues throughout the year. But it's also something that we're improving and learning from too. We don't have it all done, and I would say perfect, right? There's a lot of things that change, things you learn from, and that can be implemented in your next year, making adjustments to your current plan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see, great. So we have a question in the chat. How can you build, the question is, how can you build up your staff in a strategic plan, both from a skill point and from a morale and dedication? Want to take it, Tyler?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned using Section 8 of the PPR, sending that out as a general overview of topics. You can send that out and people can rank it, or you might be able to get staff to submit, some of the things that they'd like to learn on. What we have just, gotten back is presentation skills like a Toastmasters, Google Sheets, some of these things. That's really critical to understand because you have someone that is communicating that they would like to learn more on a topic. So when you listen to that and you provide a training plan as part of accomplishing the bigger goal of improving the efficiency of serving consumers, that helps build that morale and dedication by listening to your team and showing that. Recognizing their parts in it, the success that they have helped, achieve, and also being comfortable to have the conversations of maybe opportunities for growth. So those are some good ways that you can build up the staff and the strategic plan, because if you're just communicating down what needs to happen, that's not IL, I don't think. That's not our foundation anyway. So making sure that we have that buy-in and remembering to maybe send a reminder of the why on a couple of things, like slowing down to take time to explain the why helps with that buy-in. If you're just giving a directive and saying this needs to be done, and sometimes you have to do that, but taking time to slow down and showing how that priority of looking at this one county to increase by 20 consumers fits into a bigger strategic plan of building footprints in outlying counties that feed into the spill of making sure that consumers, living in rural communities have access, it all feeds together, but taking time to explain that why helps with the buy-in. I hope that answered the question. Just some examples.
Yeah. No, that's great. And it kind of leads into something, I forgot who mentioned it, but those that are joining the Nickel conference next week, there's going to be kind of a follow-up presentation more about that strategic planning and how this kind of all comes together, right? Great. We have another question in the chat, I think. Okay, so this is a little bit long, but one of the main pieces of feedback that we've had from ACL is that our work plan is too similar to the previous years. Do you have any recommendations on how to square this circle as though we do adjust our specific metric goals, so many of the barriers our folks face don't really change. Examples, transportation and housing, or demographics or underserved populations. I'd like to resist the urge to get too granular, but I don't know how to really dial in without changing just to change and being a token. So I like this question. Go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah. So what I would say for this one, and I'd love to hear from other people as well on similar things, is to maybe get more granular on this, because if you're saying this is my action plan for the next year and you're not meeting those outcomes because there's stuff that, are some of the transportation housing barriers, is there a more specific outcome maybe that's more achievable that may lead to that bigger outcome in the future? So maybe that's for transportation. It could be like, maybe do you have a partnership already with local transportation authorities? If not, could you make a partnership? Could you start helping them with their disability services and being approved for Dollar Transit, just to open up that barrier? Same thing with housing. What committees can you join if that hasn't been specific? So I think going a little bit more specific and maybe even smaller scope so you can show those changes year by year would be good.
Tyler, do you have any other thoughts on this, or it's okay if not?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with Forrest. We're learning also not biting off more than you can chew on work plans, and I think that's really relevant. And this even goes to the earlier question about buy-in. Do you want to try to accomplish 20 things? Semi-okay? Or do you really want to accomplish some really cool things, 2 or 3, big picture things, and show those wins and show that difference that's been made? So, I agree with what Forrest said of biting, off a reasonable amount for your CIL.
Great. And it looks like we'll probably have time for one more question, but I do just want to plug the evaluation in the chat. We do appreciate any of your feedback. And if you could either click on the feedback, the link in the chat, or complete it when we end the webinar. But I see one more question in the chat. What if the spill has so many activities that it's hard to make many activities in the SIL plan? And yeah, Tyler,
Mary Kate, I might, thinking about this, alignment where possible is important, and showing how that connects to the spill is critical, right? But remember that CILs are community-based organizations, right? And while we agree for this state plan to address, right, maybe it doesn't fit a specific demographic or a geographical area in our catchment area, right? So, you know, maybe you address it somewhere differently, maybe you condense it. So I think the key word here, Edgar, is the alignment.
Great, thank you. And I see we have an attendee with their hand raised, Beth Pinkham. Did you have a question? I can unmute you. Oh, nope, I think not. All right. I'll give it a couple more seconds before. Oh, I see another. Yep. Any lasting questions before we wrap up today? We will, this PowerPoint and recording will be available on the IRLU website so that you can go back to. Same with the material. And we'll also, it also includes the link to the outcome measure toolkit as well. So without any more questions, we'll wrap up today. Thank you so much, Forrest and Tyler, for joining us today. I think that was super informative. And actually, if you go to the next slide, I think it's the contact info. Again, we would love your feedback if you want to complete the evaluation form. But with that, we're going to end today. So thank you, everyone, for joining. And I see in the chat, if you can email me if you need a certificate of attendance. That was a question in the chat. I will put my email in the chat. All right. Thank you, everyone.